Welcome to Civil Disobedience by Henry David Thoreau, a presentation of the Cato University, a project of the Cato Institute. Civil Disobedience by Henry David Thoreau was written by Wendy McElroy and narrated by Craig Deichman. The quotations are read by Bill Middleton. This recording of Civil Disobedience by Henry David Thoreau was produced in 1985 by Carmichael & Carmichael Incorporated, which holds the copyright thereto. Neither this recording nor any portion of it may be reproduced or used for any purpose without prior written authorization from Carmichael & Carmichael Incorporated.
Henry David Thoreau was a quiet, introspective man who lived and died over a century ago in the small village of Concord, Massachusetts. Neighbors often saw Thoreau wandering the woods around Concord, recording the daily growth of plants and the migration of birds in his journal. They would have been astounded to learn that this lanky, soft-spoken man was destined to influence men like Mohandas K. Gandhi, Leo Tolstoy, and Martin Luther King. Indeed, Gandhi named his movement for Indian independence after one of Thoreau's essays. What do these two men have in common? How could Thoreau speak to Gandhi over a chasm of time and cultures? The answer lies in Thoreau's essay, Civil Disobedience. A contemporary of Gandhi commented on this.
Henry David Thoreau is known to the American people as the author of Walden. To Gandhi in India, he is known primarily as the author of the immortal essay on civil disobedience. Gandhi is today giving back to America what he received from her by way of Thoreau. The American people can best show their esteem for Gandhi by enshrining Thoreau in their hearts.
Civil disobedience is a classic analysis of the individual's relationship to the state. Thoreau's brief essay examines why men obey governmental law, even when they think the law is unjust. Cooperating with an unjust law through obedience or financial support, Thoreau concludes, simply fuels the injustice. This is the lesson Thoreau carried to King and Gandhi. Men of good conscience can fight injustice without using violence. They can slow and eventually stop the machinery of injustice by applying the friction of non-cooperation. This theme runs throughout Civil Disobedience, but the essay is not really about abstract theory. It is about Thoreau's personal response to his imprisonment for breaking the law. Thoreau despised the institution of slavery in America, and because tax revenues contributed to the support of slavery, Thoreau became a tax rebel. There were no income taxes to worry about, and Thoreau did not own enough property to worry about property taxes. But there was the hated poll tax, a tax levied on persons without regard for their income or wealth. The poll tax threatened to violate the pocket and conscience of Henry David Thoreau. Thoreau declined to pay the poll tax. Consequently, he was arrested and jailed in July of 1846. Thoreau was to remain in jail until he paid a fine, which he also refused to do. But relatives of Thoreau, without his knowledge or consent, paid the fine for him, so he was released after passing only one night in jail. Thoreau's incarceration may have been brief, but its effects are with us still. Civil Disobedience, an essay ignored during Thoreau's lifetime, has since influenced a wide range of thinkers. It is one of the most influential essays ever written by an American. We shall examine the message of civil disobedience not only by referring to the text, but also by looking at the reactions of Thoreau's contemporaries to it and to him. First, we'll sketch Thoreau's life as it relates to the essay. Next, we shall look at Thoreau's imprisonment, using passages from Civil Disobedience where Thoreau reflects on this experience. And finally, we will examine the text of Civil Disobedience in detail, quoting a substantial portion of this brief essay. Now, let us turn to Thoreau. Who was Henry David Thoreau? Born in July of 1817, he was the son of a pencil maker. Born in a New England village surrounded by woods and meadows and flowing rivers, he was a student of nature. It has been said that the biggest things about Thoreau were his nose and his ideas. A more detailed description comes from his friend and mentor, Ralph Waldo Emerson.
He was of short stature, firmly built, of light complexion, with strong, serious blue eyes and a grave aspect, his face covered in the late years with a becoming beard. His senses were acute, his frame well knit and sturdy, his hands strong and skilful in the use of tools. He could pace 16 rods more accurately than another man could measure them with rod and chain. He could find his path in the woods at night. The length of his walk uniformly made the length of his writing. If shut up in the house, he did not write at all.
Emerson also observed Thoreau's psychology.
He was bred to no profession. He never married. He lived alone. He never went to church. He never voted. He refused to pay a tax to the state. He ate no flesh. He drank no wine. He never knew the use of tobacco. And though a naturalist, he used neither trap nor gun. He chose to be the bachelor of thought and nature. He had no talent for wealth, and knew how to be poor without the least hint of squalor or inelegance. He chose to be rich by making his wants few and supplying them himself.
If it is possible for one word to summarize a man's life, the word for Thoreau would be the advice he offered in his most famous book, Walden. Simplify, simplify, simplify. Thoreau was a simple man who tried to organize his life around basic truths. On long daily walks and in solitude, he listened to the inner voice of conscience, a voice all men possess, but few men follow. As Thoreau explained in Walden, to follow this voice is to become a philosopher in the true sense.
To be a philosopher is not merely to have subtle thoughts, but so to love wisdom as to live according to its dictates, a life of simplicity, independence, magnanimity, and trust. It is to solve some of the problems of life, not only theoretically, but practically.
Thoreau's attempt to apply principles to his daily life led to his retreat to the woods, where he lived by his own hands. It also led to his imprisonment, and finally, to the essay Civil Disobedience. Oddly enough, Thoreau's contemporaries did not see him as a political theorist or as a radical. They either dismissed or ignored his political essays, including Civil Disobedience. Thoreau was best known as an eccentric naturalist. He filled his journals with notes on the nesting of birds and the spawning of fish. His observations earned him honorary membership in the Boston Natural History Society. Friends said of Thoreau that he talked as though nature had also been born and bred in Concord, Massachusetts. Although Thoreau wrote a journal filling 39 volumes, he published, in addition to essays, only 2 books in his lifetime. These were Walden and Week on the Concord and Merrimack Rivers. Because these books deal with nature, they added to Thoreau's reputation as a naturalist. Thoreau probably saw himself this way, as a naturalist first and as a reformer second. Certainly he preferred wandering the woods of Concord over preaching to its inhabitants. Thoreau did not have to wander far from home to satisfy his appetite for ideas. During the early 19th century, New England was the center of an intellectual movement called Transcendentalism. In 1834, while Thoreau was a student at Harvard, the leading Transcendentalists moved into a substantial house at the outskirts of Concord, thus converting the village into the heart of this important movement. The man who caused this flurry was Ralph Waldo Emerson. There has never been much agreement about the definition of Transcendentalism, or whether it can be defined at all. Some critics remark that whatever is unintelligible must be transcendental. One even suggested that Transcendentalism probably involves operating on the teeth. Emerson's refusal to be systematic makes definition all the more difficult. There are, however, some broad areas of agreement among Transcendentalists. As a philosophy, it emphasizes idealism rather than materialism. That is, it views the world as an expression of spirit, and every individual as an expression of a common humanity. To be human is to be born with moral imperatives or commands, which are not learned from experience, but are discovered by introspection. Because of this, everyone must be free to act according to his conscience in order to find the truth buried within. Although Emerson's focus on the individual must have appealed to Thoreau, there was an inherent tension between Thoreau's practical, earthy ways and the abstract quality of transcendentalism. Thoreau wanted to incorporate principles into daily life. He wanted to taste and feel the principles in the air around him. Consider this passage from Walden.
I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately, to front only the essential facts of life, and see if I could not learn what it had to teach, and not, when I came to die, discover that I had not lived. I did not wish to live what was not life. Living is dear. Nor did I wish to practice resignation, unless it was quite necessary. I wanted to live deep and suck out all the marrow of life, to live so sturdily and Spartan-like as to put to rout all that was not life, to cut a broad swath and shave close, to drive life into a corner and reduce it to its lowest terms, and, if it proved to be mean, why then to get the whole and genuine meanness of it, and publish its meanness to the world, or if it were sublime, to know it by experience, and be able to give a true account of it in my next excursion.
Emerson, especially in his later years, seemed very distant from Thoreau's lusty approach to life.
Henry Thoreau sports the doctrines of activity. But I say, what do we? We want to sally into the regions of wisdom. And do we go out and lay a stone wall or dig a well or turnips? No. We leave the children, sit down by a fire, compose our bodies to corpses, shut our hands, shut our eyes, that we may be entranced and see truly.
Given this difference of approach, it is no wonder that Emerson did not embrace the ideas in Civil Disobedience, nor did he approve of Thoreau's imprisonment. Emerson's disapproval, however, should not lead us to understate his influence on Thoreau. Thoreau met Emerson in 1837 through a mutual friend who noticed a similarity in their views. Thoreau moved into the Emerson home 4 years later and assumed responsibility for many of the practical details of Emerson's life. During this period, Thoreau was so influenced by Emerson that an acquaintance described him as a strawberry from Emerson's garden. The 25-year-old admirer actually adopted Emerson's gestures and traits. This was noted by a former classmate of Thoreau's.
I happened to meet Thoreau in Mr. Emerson's. I was quite startled by the transformation that had taken place in him. His short figure and general cast of countenance were of course unchanged, but in his manners, in the tones of his voice, in his modes of expression, even in the hesitations and pauses of his speech, he had become the counterpart of Mr. Emerson. I took the opportunity, as they sat near together talking, of listening with closed eyes, and I was unable to determine with certainty which was speaking.
This influence was not one-sided. If Emerson brought a philosophical framework to Thoreau's life, Thoreau brought a fresh sense of nature to the older man. Emerson's son described his father's delight in being led to the very inner shrine of the wood god by Thoreau, a man who was clear-eyed and true and stern enough to be trusted with the secrets of the wood. Emerson described Thoreau's mind as remarkably free and erect. Transcendentalism was Thoreau's intellectual training ground. His first appearance in print was a poem entitled Sympathy. It was published in the first issue of The Dial, a Transcendentalist paper. As Transcendentalists migrated to Concord one by one, Thoreau was exposed to all facets of the movement and took his place in its inner circle. At Emerson's suggestion, he kept a daily journal from which most of Walden was eventually culled. Thoreau kept this journal from 1837 until shortly before his death. In the midst of this intellectual whirl, and under Emerson's influence, Thoreau decided to become a writer. Despite the influence of the Transcendentalists, Thoreau maintained his distance from them and from Emerson, for unlike many of the Transcendentalists, Thoreau longed for a life both concrete and spiritual. He wanted to translate his thoughts into action. While transcendentalists praised nature, Thoreau took daily walks through it. His passion was for communing with nature rather than for discussing it. Emerson did not quite approve of Thoreau's solitary jaunts through the woods, nor of the attitude those walks reflected. He remarked to Thoreau that if God had wished him to spend so much time in the swamp, he would have made him a frog. Thoreau's political ideas, as we said, were not well known in his own day. They were usually presented in lectures for small audiences or in articles buried in low-circulation magazines. Civil Disobedience, for example, was first given as a lecture at the Concord Meeting Hall. In 1849, it was published under the title Resistance to Civil Government, in the first and only issue of Boston Aesthetic Papers. Such forums were unlikely to enhance Thoreau's political reputation. After Thoreau's death, his sister Sophia prepared his uncollected works for posthumous publication by Ticknor and Fields. The political essays were held until last. Even then, they appeared to be added on in a volume entitled A Yankee in Canada, with anti-slavery and reform papers. This volume included Civil Disobedience, entitled On the Duty of Civil Disobedience. Why were these essays published last? Possibly because they were not considered representative of Thoreau. Perhaps because many of them were written in response to specific events, leading Sophia to think they had lost relevance over the years. Or perhaps because their political slant was so unpopular that many reviewers wished they had died with the man. In 1890, Henry Salt published a collection of Thoreau's political essays, including Civil Disobedience. This book profoundly influenced a young lawyer in South Africa who was protesting the government's treatment of immigrant workers from India. The lawyer was Mohandas K. Gandhi. Gandhi found in Thoreau the techniques he would use in the struggle for Indian independence. Years later, Gandhi thanked the American people for Henry David Thoreau.
You have given me a teacher in Thoreau, who furnished me through his essay on the duty of civil disobedience, scientific confirmation of what I was doing in South Africa.
Thoreau believed the state should never rank above the individual conscience. If the state demands our first allegiance, we should disobey. By embracing this message and the strategy of civil disobedience, Gandhi focused world attention on this shy American philosopher. Now, let's turn to Thoreau's imprisonment. In July of 1846, Henry David Thoreau was imprisoned for refusing to pay his poll tax. Thoreau placed his conscience before the law.
Must the citizen even for a moment, or in the least degree, resign his conscience to the legislator? Why has every man a conscience then? I think that we should be men first and subjects afterward. It is not desirable to cultivate a respect for the law so much as for the right. The only obligation which I have a right to assume is to do at any time what I think right.
Although many Quaker writers had called for civil disobedience against war and slavery, Thoreau's essay is not tied to a particular religion. This secular call for the inviolability of conscience may account for some of Thoreau's current popularity. The personal quality of civil disobedience may also contribute to its popularity. Thoreau exudes a sincerity more common to diaries and correspondence than to political tracts. Although it helps to know the political background of Thoreau's essay, it is more important to know that civil disobedience was Thoreau's response to imprisonment, to his first clash with government. For the first time, Thoreau experienced the might of the state. Before his imprisonment, Thoreau encountered the state mainly through his postman. His only other brush had come in 1838 when he worked as a schoolmaster.
Some years ago, the state met me in behalf of the church and commanded me to pay a certain sum toward the support of a clergyman whose preaching my father attended, but never I myself. Pay, it said, or be locked up in jail. I declined to pay. But unfortunately, another man saw fit to pay it. I did not see why the schoolmaster should be taxed to support the priest, and not the priest the schoolmaster. for I was not the state schoolmaster, but I supported myself through voluntary subscription. However, at the request of the selectmen, I condescended to make some such statement as this in writing. Know all men by these presents that I, Henry Thoreau, do not wish to be regarded as a member of any incorporated society which I have not joined. The state, having thus learned that I did not wish to be regarded as a member of that church, has never made a like demand on me since. If I had known how to name them, I should then have signed off in detail from all the societies which I never signed on to, but I did not know where to find a complete list.
Years later, a tax collector paid Thoreau a visit, but went away empty-handed. Thoreau's encounter with the state had begun in earnest. He was arrested on a trip to the village to have one of his shoes repaired. Thoreau spent the night in jail, and after being released the next day, completed his errand with the shoemaker. The matter ended there. Thoreau did not pay future taxes. He was not imprisoned again. The imprisonment was brief, but its influence was profound. Thoreau now experienced concretely what he had known abstractly.
The state never intentionally confronts a man's sense, intellectual or moral, but only his body, his senses. It is not armed with superior wit or honesty, but with superior physical strength. I was not born to be forced. I will breathe after my own fashion. Let us see who is the strongest.
Prior to his arrest, Thoreau lived a quiet, solitary life at Walden, an isolated pond in the woods about 1.5 miles from Concord. There, on a lot owned by Emerson, he built a cabin some 30 or 40 feet from the water's edge. Thoreau returned to Walden to mull over his prison experience. His mind turned over and over on two questions. Why do some men obey laws without asking if the laws are just or unjust? Why do others obey laws they think are wrong? His view of the state remained the same. After all, it was this view which led Thoreau down the road to prison in the first place. But he gained a new perspective on human nature. Consider how he ends his short, matter-of-fact account of prison with a comment on the townspeople of Concord.
I began to comprehend what its inhabitants were all about. I saw to what extent the people among whom I lived could be trusted as good neighbors and friends, that their friendship was for summer weather only, that they did not greatly propose to do right, that after all they were not so noble, but they treated the thief as he had treated them, and hoped, by a certain outward observance and a few prayers, and by walking in a particular straight, though useless path from time to time, to save their souls.
In contrast, Thoreau's account of prison has a dry, journalistic flavor. It is almost clinical, as illustrated in his description of prison breakfast.
In the morning, our breakfast were put through the hole in the door in small oblong square tin pans made to fit, and holding a pint of chocolate with brown bread and an iron spoon. When they called for the vessels again, I was green enough to return what breakfast I had left, but my comrade seized it and said that I should lay that up for lunch or dinner.
The only break in this journalistic style is Thoreau's account of lying on his cot at night. Here the description is tranquil, almost idyllic.
It was like traveling into a far country, such as I had never expected to behold. It seemed to me that I had never heard the town clock strike before, nor the evening sounds of the village, for we slept with the windows open, which were inside the grating. It was to see my native village in the light of the Middle Ages, and our Concord was turned into a Rhine stream, and visions of knights and castles passed before me.
The reactions of fellow citizens distressed Thoreau far more than prison. Thoreau's well-intentioned mother and aunts provided unwelcome aid by paying his fine. He was released from jail the next morning, and according to the jailer, the payment made him mad as the devil. He was angry enough, it seems, to direct a barb in civil disobedience at those who presumed to pay other people's fines.
If others pay the tax which is demanded of me from a sympathy with the state, they do but what they have already done in their own case. If they pay the tax from a mistaken interest in the individual taxed, to save his property or prevent his going to jail, it is because they have not considered wisely how far they let their private feelings interfere with the public good.
Thoreau felt more disdain than anger for the men who actually imprisoned him.
They plainly did not know how to treat me, but behaved like persons who were underbred. In every threat and in every compliment there was a blunder, for they thought that my chief desire was to stand on the other side of that stone wall. As they could not reach me, they had resolved to punish my body, just as boys, if they cannot come at some person against whom they have a spite, will abuse his dog.
Thoreau placed fellow prisoners in another category. He described his cellmate dispassionately. The man was quite domesticated and content, since he got his board for nothing and thought he was well treated. Thoreau passed no judgment. The townspeople were in another category. Their reaction troubled him deeply. Why? He now saw them as summer weather friends, and their reactions made him question the response of most people to government. The only note of distress in Thoreau's prison account is when he observed that upon his release, his neighbors would not salute him.
It was formerly the custom in our village, when a poor debtor came out of jail, for his acquaintances to salute him, looking through their fingers, which were crossed to represent the grating of a jail window. My neighbors did not thus salute me, but first looked at me, and then at one another, as if I had returned from a long journey.
Gandhi ended an account of his second imprisonment in South Africa by reflecting on Thoreau's reaction to his neighbors.
Placed in a similar position for refusing his poll tax, the American citizen Thoreau expressed similar thoughts in 1849. Seeing the wall of the cell in which he was confined, made of solid stone 2 or 3 feet thick, and the door of wood and iron a foot thick, he said to himself, "I say that if there was a wall of stone between me and my townmen, there was a still more difficult one to climb or break through before they could get to be as free as I was."
The children of Concord brightened Thoreau's mood by urging him to lead a huckleberry party. Thoreau immediately agreed. Huckleberrying was one of Thoreau's valued pastimes, and it made him a favorite with the children. Having Thoreau along meant they would find bushes thick with fruit, and if one of them stumbled and spilled all his berries, Thoreau would kneel beside the weeping child. If there were no obstacles for children to trip over, he explained, berries would never be scattered and planted. Then what would become of huckleberrying? Thus Thoreau ends his chronicle of prison.
I proceeded to finish my errand, and having put on my mended shoe, joined the huckleberry party, and in half an hour was in the midst of a huckleberry field on one of our highest hills, 2 miles off, and then the state was nowhere to be seen.
This was the importance of the field. The state was nowhere to be seen. With a complete lack of bitterness or cynicism, Thoreau shed the discomfort of prison. He went from jail to berry picking as though it were part of his normal routine. But he could not shed the insights gained in prison. Thoreau probably brooded over the reaction of Emerson, who criticized the imprisonment as pointless. According to some accounts, Emerson visited Thoreau in prison and asked through the bars, "Henry, what are you doing in there?" Thoreau replied, "Waldo, the question is, what are you doing out there?" This story, even if fictional, nicely captures the spirits of the two men. Emerson may have agreed with Thoreau in theory, but Emerson's cautious nature made him view the imprisonment as short-sighted. To protest an isolated evil was to lose perspective on the whole picture. Society, Emerson believed, could be redeemed only by a spiritual rebirth of humanity. Emerson missed the point of Thoreau's protest. Thoreau did not protest to change society. He followed his conscience and exercised his only control over an unjust situation, namely the decision to cooperate or not. If we do not distinguish right from wrong, Thoreau argued, we eventually lose the capacity to make the distinction altogether. We become morally numb.
After the first blush of sin comes its indifference, and from immoral it becomes, as it were, unmoral, and not quite necessary to that life which we have made. The broadest and most prevalent error requires the most disinterested virtue to sustain it.
Near the end of Thoreau's life, when asked if he had made peace with God, Thoreau quietly replied, "I have never quarreled with him." Perhaps this would have been the real cost of paying the poll tax. Thoreau would have been quarreling with his own conscience, which for him was quarreling with God. If Thoreau wished to hold others responsible for their actions, he had to live by the same standard. When the perplexed taxman asked what to do in the face of Thoreau's refusal to pay, Thoreau told him to resign. Since the tax collector chose to be an agent of the government, Thoreau insisted on confronting him with that choice. Subjecting himself to the same standards, Thoreau found he could not, in good conscience, pay the tax. This was the motive and the message of his imprisonment. Before turning to the text of Civil Disobedience, we should consider an accusation commonly made against Thoreau, that he was indolent, without direction or ambition. Even Emerson believed this.
I cannot help counting it a fault in him that he had no ambition. Wanting this, instead of engineering for all America, he was the captain of a huckleberry party.
Thoreau was well aware of these accusations.
If a man walks in the woods for love of them half of each day, he is in danger of being regarded as a loafer. But if he spends his whole day as a speculator, shearing off those woods, he is esteemed an industrious and enterprising citizen.
Emerson and Thoreau had different values, but each pursued his own values energetically. Thoreau treasured the solitude offered by his daily walks more than work, which Emerson considered productive. Why would a man who loved nature above human society, a man who spent so much time in the woods that his nickname became the Bachelor of Nature, allow himself to be imprisoned over a small sum of money? The answer lies in the text of Civil Disobedience. Civil disobedience is a classic statement of the relationship of the individual to the state. The first sentence sets the tone. It endorses Thomas Jefferson's belief that the best government governs least. Thoreau begins here, but he does not stop here. He carries Jefferson's logic one step further.
I heartily accept the motto, that government is best which governs least, and I should like to see it acted up to more rapidly and systematically. Carried out, it finally amounts to this, which also I believe. That government is best which governs not at all, and when men are prepared for it, that will be the kind of government they will have. Government is at best an expedient.
Because of statements like this, and because he emphasizes the primacy of the individual, Thoreau has been called an anarchist. Is this correct? Does Thoreau reject all political authority on principle? Does Thoreau's view of the American government illustrate his attitude toward all governments? These questions are not easily answered. After extending Jefferson's call for the least government to a call for no government, Thoreau pulls back. He dissociates himself from what he calls no government men.
But, to speak practically and as a citizen, unlike those who call themselves no government men, I ask for, not at once no government, but at once a better government. Let every man make known what kind of government would command his respect, and that will be one step toward obtaining it.
Thoreau may be saying that he favors no government in the long run as an ideal, but recognizes the need for better government in the short run. Whatever his position, however, one thing is clear. Thoreau denies the right of any government to automatic and unthinking obedience. Obedience should depend on whether a government deserves it, and it should be withheld from an unjust government. To drive his point home, Thoreau recalls how the American founding fathers rebelled against an established government.
All men recognize the right of revolution, that is, the right to refuse allegiance to and to resist the government when its tyranny or its inefficiency are great and unendurable. But almost all say that such is not the case now. But such was the case, they think, in the Revolution of '75. If one were to tell me that this was a bad government because it taxed certain commodities brought to its ports, it is most probable that I should not make an ado about it, for I can do without them. All machines have their friction, and possibly this does enough good to counterbalance the evil.
Thoreau compares government to a machine, and the problems of government to friction. Friction is normal to a machine, so the mere presence of friction cannot justify revolution. So when is revolution warranted according to Thoreau? In two cases. First, when the friction comes to have its own machine. That is, when the injustice is no longer an occasional part of government, but one of its major characteristics. And second, when the machine demands that people become part of the friction by cooperating with injustice.
If the injustice is part of the necessary friction of the machine of government, let it go. Let it go. Perchance it will wear smooth. Certainly the machine will wear out. If the injustice has a spring, or a pulley, or a rope, or a crank, exclusively for itself, then perhaps you may consider whether the remedy will not be worse than the evil. But if it is of such a nature that it requires you to be the agent of injustice to another, then, I say, break the law. Let your life be a counter-friction to stop the machine. What I have to do is to see, at any rate, that I do not lend myself to the wrong which I condemn.
This is the key to Thoreau's political philosophy. The individual is the final judge of right and wrong. More than this, since only individuals act, only individuals can act unjustly. When the government knocks on a door, it is an individual in the form of a postman or tax collector whose hand hits the wood. Thoreau recognizes this responsibility when he advises the taxman to resign.
I meet this American government or its representative, the state government, directly and face-to-face once a year, no more, in the person of the tax-gatherer, and it then says distinctly, "Recognize me." And the simplest, the most effectual, and the indispensable mode of treating with it on this head is to deny it then. My civil neighbor, the tax-gatherer, is the very man I have to deal with. For it is, after all, with men and not with parchment that I quarrel. And he has voluntarily chosen to be an agent of the government.
If it is improper to be a tax collector, then what is the proper relationship between government and individuals? Isn't government the voice of the people? Thoreau admits government may voice the will of the majority, but it may also express the will of politicians.
The government itself, which is only the mode which the people have chosen to execute their will, is equally liable to be abused and perverted before the people can act through it. Witness the present Mexican War, the work of comparatively a few individuals using the standing government as their tool. For in the outset, the people would not have consented to this measure.
Even if government expresses the will of the people, is obedience required? The majority is strong, but not necessarily right. Where does this leave the dissident? Where does it leave Thoreau? Perhaps the best description of Thoreau's ideal relationship between government and the individual occurs in Thoreau's description of an ideal state.
There will never be a really free and enlightened state until the state comes to recognize the individual as a higher and independent power from which all its own power and authority are derived, and treats him accordingly. I please myself with imagining a state at last which can afford to be just to all men, and treat the individual with respect as a neighbor, which even would not think it inconsistent with its own repose, if a few were to live aloof from it, not meddling with it, nor embraced by it.
How close did the American government in Thoreau's day come to this ideal? Not very close, according to Thoreau. True, some of the incriminating evidence against the American government was circumstantial, but circumstantial evidence can be very strong. Has the milk been watered down? Maybe you didn't witness it personally, but you should be highly suspicious, Thoreau suggests, when you find a trout in your milk. Thoreau finds two trout in the milk of American government: its support of slavery and its waging of war against Mexico.
I cannot for an instant recognize the political organization as my government, which is the slave's government as well. When a sixth of the population of a nation, which is undertaken to be the refuge of liberty, are slaves, and a whole country is unjustly overrun and conquered by a foreign army and subjected to military law, I think that it is not too soon for honest men to rebel and revolutionize.
Thoreau was an abolitionist, as were his parents before him. Abolitionism, the radical branch of the anti-slavery movement, called for an immediate end to slavery. All men, it said, are self-owners with a right to their own bodies and labor. No moral or practical considerations outweigh this right. Some historians suggest that Thoreau's woodland residence was part of the Underground Railroad by which fugitive slaves traveled from the South to the safety of Canada. There is no way to confirm this, but on at least one occasion, Thoreau aided a fugitive slave who collapsed at his door. An acquaintance recorded the incident.
I sat and watched the singularly lowly and tender devotion of the scholar to the slave. Again and again, this coolest and calmest of men drew near to the trembling Negro and bade him feel at home, and have no fear that any power should again wrong him. He could not walk this day, but must mount guard over the fugitive, for slave hunters were not extinct in those days. He must be fed, his swollen feet bathed, and he must think of nothing but rest.
Thoreau applauded John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry in 1859. Brown and his companions attacked this government armory in Virginia, hoping to inspire a slave revolt. Brown was arrested. In the following 7 weeks he was tried and hanged. Many abolitionists decried the escapade. The Liberator, the main organ of abolitionism, called Brown's act a misguided, wild, and apparently insane effort. This may have reflected no more than the pacifism of its editor, William Lloyd Garrison. But Thoreau saw it differently. He saw it as a failure of nerve by anti-slavery men who became frightened when words turned to deeds. Civil Disobedience is also an anti-war document, which ranks the Mexican-American War as an evil comparable to slavery. The 1840s was a period of American expansion, sometimes called manifest destiny. This was the belief in the destiny of Americans to expand across the continent, civilizing the wilderness and natives as they went. Part of this expansion was the annexation of Texas, which sparked a war with Mexico. This annexation was doubly offensive to Thoreau because it permitted slavery in the new territory. But the extension of slavery was only one of many controversial aspects of this war. When American soldiers invaded Mexican territory, this looked like a war of conquest, not a war of defense. Taxes mushroomed. The country assumed a military air. On one of his visits to Concord, Thoreau was horrified to discover that some of his neighbors actively supported war with Mexico. And he was perplexed by those who did not support the war, but who willingly financed it through taxes. There is an important point to remember. Thoreau's imprisonment was a protest against slavery. But Civil Disobedience, written after the outbreak of the Mexican-American War, protests both slavery and war. In fact, the opening paragraph of the essay mentions the war, but says nothing of slavery. Thoreau describes the war as the work of a few individuals using the standing government as their tool. Here he jumps into one of the major debates in early American history. Should there be a standing army? A standing army is one maintained during peacetime. Thoreau fears the effect of such an army on the character of men, especially on the character of soldiers. He believes that soldiers, through their absolute obedience to the state, become less than human.
Now, what are they? Men at all? Or small movable forts and magazines at the service of some unscrupulous man in power? Visit the Navy Yard. Behold a Marine. Such a man as an American government can make, or such as it can make a man with its black arts, a mere shadow and reminiscence of humanity. A man laid out alive and standing. The mass of men serve the state thus, not as men mainly, but as machines with their bodies. They are the standing army, and the militia, jailers, constables, posse comitatus. In most cases there is no free exercise whatever of the judgment or of the moral sense, but they put themselves on a level with wood and earth and stones. Such command no more respect than men of straw or a lump of dirt.
If men should not become soldiers or tax collectors, how should they deal with the American government?
How does it become a man to behave toward this American government today? I answer that he cannot without disgrace be associated with it.
But most men did associate with the government. Was this because they agreed with slavery and the war? Thoreau considers this possibility and dismisses it.
I think sometimes, why this people mean well, they are only ignorant. They would do better if they knew how. But I think again, this is no reason why I should do as they do, or permit others to suffer much greater pain of a different kind.
The problem remains. If people are not malicious, why do they obey? This is the key question civil disobedience asks. Why do men obey? One reason is obvious. People believe they need a government, even an imperfect one. Immediately after referring to government as an expedient, Thoreau says people accept government as a necessary evil.
But it is not the less necessary for this, for the people must have their complicated machinery or other and hear its din, to satisfy that idea of government which they have. Governments show thus how successfully men can be imposed on, even impose on themselves for their own advantage.
Some people support government from self-interest. Thoreau mentions merchants and farmers in Massachusetts who profited from war and slavery. Others obey government because they dread the consequence of disobedience. They fear the government and think it impossible to resist without becoming a martyr. This is the neighbor who says to Thoreau, "If I deny the authority of the state when it presents its tax bill, it will soon confiscate my property and harass me and my children without end." Fear makes many people comply with laws they know to be unjust. Thoreau sympathizes with this dilemma.
I do not wish to quarrel with any man or nation. I do not wish to split hairs, to make fine distinctions, or set myself up as better than my neighbors. I seek rather, I may say, even an excuse for conforming to the laws of the land. Indeed, I have reason to suspect myself on this head, and each year, as the tax-gatherer comes round, I find myself disposed to review the acts and position of the general and state governments and the spirit of the people to discover a pretext for conformity.
Thoreau knows his neighbor is correct. If the man resists, the state will use force and seize his property.
When I converse with the freest of my neighbors, I perceive that the long and short of the matter is that they cannot spare the protection of the existing government, and they dread the consequences of disobedience to it to their property and families. This is hard. It makes it impossible for a man to live honestly and at the same time comfortably in outward respects.
Thoreau, by his own lights, was fortunate. He had no property to be seized and no children to go hungry if he were imprisoned.
It cost me less in every sense to incur the penalty of disobedience to the state than it would to obey. I should feel as if I were worth less in that case.
Because Thoreau was in a fortunate position, he does not criticize men who obey from fear of harming their family. Thoreau's criticism is leveled at another form of obedience. The obedience Thoreau condemns stems from a genuine respect for the authority of government. The law is the law and should be obeyed regardless of content. In upholding unjust laws, Thoreau sees good men become the agents of injustice. A case in point was the Fugitive Slave Act, by which northern states agreed to return runaway slaves to the South. How could Thoreau comply with such a law? Instead of feeding and bathing the slave who collapsed at his door, Thoreau would have had to return him to slavery. Such laws, Thoreau says, should not inspire respect. Moreover, government uses the law as a weapon to defend itself. Thoreau learned this from his own imprisonment. Laws against tax evasion, treason, or contempt of court, laws protecting the government's authority, often have more severe penalties than laws against violent crime. And these penalties are so vague and sweeping as to invite arbitrary sentences by courts and judges.
One would think that a deliberate and practical denial of its authority was the only offense never contemplated by government. Else why has it not assigned its definite and suitable and proportionate penalty? If a man who has no property refuses but once to earn 9 shillings for the state, he is put in prison for a period unlimited by any law that I know, and determined only by the discretion of those who placed him there.
Thoreau rejects the idea that law can protect the individual. Lawyers and the courts are part of the state's defensive machinery.
The lawyer's truth is not truth, but consistency, or a consistent expediency. He well deserves to be called, as he has been called, the defender of the Constitution. There are really no blows to be given by him but defensive ones. He is not a leader, but a follower. Still thinking of the sanction which the Constitution gives to slavery, he says, "Because it was a part of the original compact, let it stand." He is unable to take a fact out of its merely political relations.
The law and courts offer no protection to Thoreau. He refuses to respect their authority. But Thoreau carries the withdrawal of support one step further. He not only rejects unjust laws, he rejects the men who create them. He withdraws his support from politicians. Politicians, Thoreau argues, serve the state and rarely make moral distinctions. They are as likely to serve the devil without intending it as they are to serve God. Thoreau's emphasis on the word intending is significant. The intentions of a politician are not important. Well-meaning politicians still stand so completely within the institution of government that they never distinctly and nakedly behold it. Thoreau's disdain for politicians may seem a logical progression from his attitude toward the law, but many of Thoreau's companions shared his view of the law without holding the lawmakers personally responsible. This viewpoint overlooks the role of choice, says Thoreau. Every politician who creates a law chooses to do so. Every agent who enforces the law chooses to do so. If you create or enforce a law with which you disagree, then you surrender your conscience to the state and should be held accountable for that decision.
If the tax gatherer or any other public officer ask me, as one has done, "But what shall I do?" my answer is, if you really wish to do anything, resign your office. When the subject has refused allegiance, and the officer has resigned his office, then the revolution is accomplished.
Holding politicians personally responsible for their actions is not the last step in Thoreau's withdrawal of support. He questions the authority of government itself. Again, the rejection of politicians may seem to imply the rejection of government. But again, many reformers rejected politicians without rejecting politics.
They who know of no pure sources of truth, who have traced up its stream no higher, stand, and wisely stand, by the Bible and the Constitution, and drink at it there with reverence and humility. But they who behold where it comes trickling into this lake or that pool, gird up their loins once more and continue their pilgrimage towards its fountainhead.
From men who know a purer source of truth, Thoreau expects more.
Those who, while they disapprove of the character and measures of a government, yield to it their allegiance and support, are undoubtedly its most conscientious supporters, and so frequently the most serious obstacles to reform. Some are petitioning the state to dissolve the Union, to disregard the requisitions of the President. Why do they not dissolve it themselves, the Union between themselves and the state, and refuse to pay their quota into its treasury? Do they not stand in the same relation to the state that the state does to the Union?
By appealing to the government, these reformers recognize and strengthen its authority.
I do not hesitate to say that those who call themselves abolitionists should at once effectually withdraw their support, both in person and property, from the government of Massachusetts, and not wait till they constitute a majority of one before they suffer the right to prevail through them. Any man more right than his neighbors constitutes a majority of one already. For it matters not how small the beginning may seem to be, but we love better to talk about it. That, we say, is our mission. Reform keeps many scores of newspapers in its service, but not one man.
These reformers prefer a safe strategy over action. Voting is commonly their substitute. But voting, Thoreau says, is nothing more than a kind of game, like checkers or backgammon, with a slight moral tinge to it. Voting plays with right and wrong. Anyone willing to leave moral decisions to the will of the majority is not really concerned that right should prevail. When resisting the poll tax, Thoreau did not consult majority opinion. He acted. If he had allowed the majority to decide whether he should pay by his own standards, he would have shown no regard for doing what is right. Moreover, Thoreau considers voting to be impotent as a means of serious reform. The machinery by which the state reforms itself is extraordinarily slow, Voting follows, it does not precede, true change.
When the majority shall at length vote for the abolition of slavery, it will be because they are indifferent to slavery, or because there is but little slavery to be abolished by their vote. As for adopting the ways which the state has provided for remedying the evil, I know not of such ways. They take too much time, and a man's life will be gone.
Does a man have the duty to pit his life against the state? No, there is no duty to fight injustice. Civil disobedience is a defense of the individual's right to disobey the state, not a demand that he do so. This is a crucial distinction. Although civil disobedience is sometimes entitled On the Duty of Civil Disobedience, this is a misnomer. Thoreau may have contributed to the use of that title by attacking a chapter from William Paley's Principles of Moral and Political Philosophy. Paley's chapter was entitled Duty of Submission to Civil Government. According to Thoreau's interpretation of this 18th century philosopher, Paley argued that all civil obligations derive from expediency. Since Thoreau attempts to show the opposite, to show that civil obedience should be morally grounded, his title On the Duty of Civil Disobedience may have been intended as a play on Paley's words. The content of civil disobedience shows clearly that Thoreau does not regard disobedience as a duty. He understands that men are involved in the business of living, and he thinks this is proper. He applies the standard of living one's own life, even to a dogged reformer like himself.
I came into this world not chiefly to make this a good place to live in, but to live in it, be it good or bad. It is not my business to be petitioning the governor or the legislature any more than it is theirs to petition me. And, if they should not hear my petition, what should I do then? But in this case the state has provided no way. Its very constitution is the evil.
Thoreau defied the state only when it came to him and demanded his money or cooperation. Thereafter, when the state ignored him, he ignored it and went about the business of living. First and foremost, people should live their lives. Does this mean that men have no duties at all? No, men have a well-defined duty. Although there is no obligation to fight against evil, there is an obligation to deny it our support. This is the conclusion at which civil disobedience arrives.
If I devote myself to other pursuits and contemplations, I must first see, at least, that I do not pursue them sitting upon another man's shoulders. If I have unjustly wrested a plank from a drowning man, I must restore it to him, though I drown myself. This, according to Paley, would be inconvenient. But he that would save his life, in such a case, shall lose it. This people must cease to hold slaves and to make war on Mexico, though it cost them their existence as a people.
This is every man's duty, to correct any injustice he causes and to withdraw his cooperation from injustice against others. This is the message of civil disobedience. Thoreau's health began to falter as early as 1855. In November 1860, while counting the number of rings on trees encrusted with snow, he caught a severe cold. The cold became a bronchial infection, which deepened into consumption. By the time Thoreau was willing to follow his doctor's advice and travel to Minnesota, the Civil War had erupted. The war was a constant source of distress to Thoreau, who said he could never recover while it lasted because he was sick for his country. The journey to Minnesota produced no lasting improvement, so Thoreau returned home to organize his papers. Friends visited him through the early months of 1862 and sat by his bed, now set up in the front parlor. Being away from the woods and nature must have been difficult, for as Thoreau confided to his friend Ellery Channing,
I cannot see on the outside at all. We thought ourselves great philosophers in those wet days when we used to go out and sit down by the wall sides.
When Channing hinted at the sad change coming over his own life, and how solitude began to peer out at him whenever he walked the wooded roads they had shared, Thoreau whispered, "It is better. Some things should end." On May 6, 1862, at the age of 44, Henry David Thoreau died. Months later, Emerson published a eulogy to his friend.
The country knows not yet
or in the least part how great a son it has lost, but he, at least, is content. His soul was made for the noblest society. He had in a short life exhausted the capabilities of this world. Wherever there is knowledge, wherever there is virtue, wherever there is beauty, he will find a home.
Thoreau's true home was the earth.
My greatest skill has been to want but little. For joy I could embrace the earth. I shall delight to be buried in it.
If you enjoyed this discussion, you will probably enjoy other products of the Cato Institute, including tapes of policy forums, monographs, books, and publications. For more information on the Cato Institute, write to Cato Institute, 1000 Massachusetts Avenue Northwest, Washington, D.C., 20001, or call 202-842-0200. For a catalog of Cato publications, call toll-free 1-800-767-1241, or visit our site on the World Wide Web at http://www.cato.org. We hope that you have enjoyed this presentation of the Cato University, a project of the Cato Institute.